Some journeys begin with a single step. Others start with a single question. What if the life you're living isn't the life you're meant to live? For Elena, that question arrived disguised as an impossible map to an impossible place. Chapter 1. The Mapmaker's Daughter in the ancient city of Valdris, where cobblestone streets wound like rivers between limestone buildings. There lived a young woman named Elena lived, her eyes holding the color of distant horizons. She was 23 years old, with dark hair that caught sunlight like captured starshine, and hands permanently stained with ink from the countless maps she drew in her father's cartography shop. Elena's father, Master Corvus, was renowned throughout the kingdom for his precise maps. Kings and merchants alike sought his work, for it was said that a map drawn by Corvus could guide a soul not just to their destination, but to their destiny. Yet Elena had always felt that something was missing from her father's meticulous charts, something that no measurement or calculation could capture. Every morning, as the first light crept through the narrow windows of their shop, Elena would trace her fingers along the maps hanging on the walls. There were charts of mountain ranges that pierced the clouds, ocean routes that connected distant continents, and city plans that revealed the hidden heartbeat of civilizations. But none of these satisfied the longing that had grown in her heart since she was a child. It was on a Tuesday morning, when the autumn air carried the scent of dying leaves and new possibilities, that Elena's life changed forever. She was organizing a stack of old manuscripts in the shop's back room when her fingers brushed against something unusual, a piece of parchment that seemed to pulse with its own warmth as she pulled it free from the pile. Elena gasped. Before her lay a map unlike any she had ever seen. Instead of the familiar lines and symbols of conventional cartography, this chart seemed to flow like water, its boundaries shifting subtly as she watched. At its center was marked a place called the Valley of Echoes, surrounded by symbols she couldn't recognize but somehow understood. A tree whose roots and branches formed an infinity symbol, a spring that flowed upward toward the stars, and a stone circle where light and shadow danced eternal spirals. Where did this come from? She whispered to herself, but even as the words left her lips, she felt she already knew. This map had been waiting for her just as she had been waiting for it. Elena, her father's voice carried from the front of the shop. The morning customers will arrive soon. Have you prepared the Morrison commission? She quickly rolled the strange map and tucked it into her apron. Coming, father. As she walked toward the front room, Elena felt something shift within her, as if a door that had been locked for years had suddenly swung open. The map in her apron seemed to whisper against her ribs, and she knew with absolute certainty that her life as she had known it was about to end. Master Corvus stood behind the main counter, his gray beard meticulously trimmed, his leather apron spotless despite years of use. He was examining a commission through his brass magnifying glass, checking each line for precision. Elena, I've been thinking about your future, he said without looking up. Master Henrik has expressed interest in having you join his cartography house in the capital. It would be a fine opportunity. Better pay, more prestigious clients, and eventually you could take over his business. Elena felt her heart sink. Master Henrik was competent but uninspired, the kind of cartographer who could map a merchant's route but could never capture the soul of a place. Father, I know it's far from home, Corvus continued, finally looking up at her with kind but practical eyes. But a woman in your position must think strategically. Cartography is a man's profession, and you'll need every advantage to succeed. The map in Elena's apron seemed to grow warmer. She touched it through the fabric, and words came to her lips that she hadn't planned to speak. What if there were places that conventional routes couldn't reach? She asked. What if there were destinations that required more than accurate measurements to find? Her father set down his magnifying glass and studied her with the same intensity he applied to his maps. Elena, cartography is about precision, not fantasy. We deal in facts, in measurable distances and proven routes. Anything else is merely the province of storytellers and dreamers. But what if the storytellers and dreamers are mapping something we can't see? Elena persisted. What if there are territories of the soul that need charting just as much as territories of the land? Master Corvus was quiet for a long moment. Finally he spoke with the gentle firmness of a father who loves his daughter but fears for her practical future. Elena, I understand the romantic appeal of such ideas. When I was young, I too wondered about lands beyond the edge of known maps. But life has taught me that security lies in the reliable. the proven, the real. The shop's bell chimed as their first customer of the day entered. Mrs. Albright, a merchant's wife who needed a city map for her visiting nephew. As Elena helped her, measuring distances and explaining street layouts, part of her mind remained focused on the mysterious map hidden in her apron. That evening, after the shop closed and her father had retired to his study to work on commission calculations, Elena climbed to her small room in the building's upper floor. By candlelight, she spread the strange map across her wooden table and studied it with the trained eye of a cartographer's daughter. The more she looked at it, the more convinced she became that this was no mere fantasy. The proportions felt right. The directional indicators aligned with actual geography she knew, and most importantly, something deep within her recognized this place as real, perhaps more real than anything she had ever mapped. She traced the route marked on the parchment with her finger. It began in Valdres and wound through forests she recognized, across mountains she had charted with her father, and then it continued into territory that existed on no map she had ever seen. The path led to the Valley of Echoes where, according to the cryptic notations written in an elegant script, all who seek their true voice shall find their eternal song. As she sat there in the flickering candlelight, Elena felt a presence in the room, as if someone were standing just beyond her peripheral vision. She turned, but saw only shadows dancing on the wall. Yet the feeling remained, the sense that she was not alone, that someone or something was watching her, waiting to see what choice she would make. She looked again at the map, and this time she noticed something she had missed before. In the corner, written in letters so small she needed to lean close to read them, were the words, "For those who hear the call, the journey begins with a single step taken in faith." Elena's heart raced. A call? Yes, that's exactly what this felt like. For years, she had felt something calling to her from beyond the edges of the known world. She had assumed it was simply wanderlust, the natural curiosity of a young woman who had spent her life drawing maps of places she had never seen. But now she understood it was something more profound, a summons from her own soul to discover who she truly was beneath the comfortable identity of dutiful daughter and skilled craftswoman. She went to her window and looked out at the sleeping city of Valdres. The familiar streets and buildings lay bathed in moonlight, as peaceful and predictable as they had been every night of her life. Tomorrow she could wake up and continue her routine, helping her father with his commissions, gradually taking over more responsibilities, eventually accepting Master Henrik's offer and settling into a respectable, secure life. Or she could follow the map. The choice should have been obvious. The practical option, the safe choice, the choice her father would approve of, was to put the map away and forget about it. But as Elena stood at her window, she felt something stirring within her that was stronger than logic or fear, a deep knowing that this map had come to her for a reason, and that ignoring its call would mean betraying something essential in herself. She returned to the table and picked up her quill. On a fresh piece of parchment, she began to write, "Dearest Father, by the time you read this, I will have begun a journey that I cannot fully explain but cannot ignore. I have found a map, not just of a place, but of a path that I must follow. I know this will seem like madness to you, but I ask you to trust that I am following something true, even if it cannot be measured or verified by conventional means. I do not know when I will return or what I will become on this journey, but I know that if I do not take this path, I will spend the rest of my life wondering who I might have been. Please forgive me for leaving without a proper goodbye. Some departures must be made quickly, before doubt has time to set in. Your loving daughter, Elena." She sealed the letter and placed it on her father's desk downstairs. Then she returned to her room and began to pack. She took only essentials, a few changes of clothes, her personal drawing supplies, the small amount of money she had saved, and, of course, the mysterious map. Everything else, the comfortable life, the secure future, the identity she had always known, she left behind. As dawn broke over Valdres, Elena slipped out of the cartography shop and walked toward the city gates. She did not look back, for she sensed that looking back might weaken her resolve. Instead, she kept her eyes fixed on the road ahead, the map warm against her heart. Her first step on the path to the Valley of Echoes, carrying her toward a destiny she could not yet imagine. The morning air was crisp and full of promise, and as Elena's footsteps echoed on the cobblestones, she felt for the first time in her life that she was walking toward herself rather than away from herself. The great adventure had begun. Chapter 2. The Sign of the Raven. The road out of Valdres stretched before Elena like an unwritten story, its dirt surface marked by the passage of countless travelers who had come before her. As the familiar city walls disappeared behind the rolling hills, she felt simultaneously liberated and terrified. For the first time in her 23 years, she had no one to answer to but herself, no duties to fulfill but the mysterious calling that had drawn her to this path. The morning sun climbed higher as Elena walked, and she found herself settling into a steady rhythm. Her pack, though not heavy, reminded her with each step that she had crossed a threshold from which there might be no return. The map tucked safely in her inner pocket seemed to pulse with each heartbeat, as if it were alive and eager to guide her to its secrets. After several hours of walking, Elena stopped to rest beside a stone well that marked the crossroads between the main highway and a smaller path that wound into the mountains. According to her father's conventional maps, this smaller path led to an abandoned mining village called Kestrel's Hollow. But according to the mysterious map, this was where her true journey would begin. As she sat on the well's stone edge and drank from her water bottle, Elena heard the sound of approaching hoofbeats. Soon, a cart came into view, pulled by a sturdy gray horse and driven by an older woman whose silver hair was braided with colorful ribbons. The woman's cart was filled with an unusual assortment of items: bundles of herbs, small carved figurines, crystals that caught the sunlight, and what appeared to be hand-drawn maps. Well, the woman said as she pulled her cart to a stop beside the well. A young traveler at the crossroads. Are you lost, child? Elena stood and brushed the dust from her skirts. I don't think so. At least I hope not. The woman's eyes were remarkably blue, like deep water touched by starlight. There was something ageless about her face, as if she could have been 50 or 150. Hope is a good compass, she said with a smile, though it doesn't always point in the direction we expect. I am Vera, and I trade in things that most people consider impossible. I'm Elena. I'm a cartographer, or at least I was. Was? Vera's eyebrows rose. That suggests a story worth hearing. Would you care to share some bread and cheese with an old woman who has more food than one person can eat? Elena hesitated. She was eager to begin following the map, but there was something about Vera that felt significant, as if this meeting were part of the path rather than a delay from it. Thank you, I'd like that. Vera climbed down from her cart with surprising agility and began unpacking a simple meal. As they ate, Elena found herself telling the older woman about the map she had discovered, her father's shop, and the irresistible call she felt to seek the Valley of Echoes. The Valley of Echoes, Vera repeated when Elena finished her story. Now that's a name I haven't heard spoken aloud in many years. Elena's heart jumped. You know of it? You believe it exists? Vera was quiet for a moment, studying Elena's face with those remarkable blue eyes. Child, I have learned that the most important places are often the ones that don't appear on conventional maps. They exist in the spaces between what we know and what we feel, in the territory of the heart that no surveyor has ever measured. But have you been there? Have you seen it? I have been to many places, Vera said cryptically. Some with my feet, some with my heart, some with my dreams. The question is not whether the Valley of Echoes exists, but whether you exist enough to find it. Elena frowned. I don't understand. Vera smiled and reached into her cart, pulling out a small object wrapped in dark cloth. When I was young, perhaps your age, I too followed a map that no one else could see. It led me on a journey that lasted 7 years and 7 days, and when I returned, I was no longer the same person who had left. She unwrapped the object, revealing a pendant made of silver and obsidian. The design was intricate, a raven in flight, its wings spread wide with tiny symbols etched along the feathers. This was given to me by someone I met on that journey, Vera continued. Someone who told me that when the time came, I would know who to give it to. She held the pendant out to Elena. I believe that time is now. Elena stared at the pendant, afraid to touch it. I can't accept this. We've only just met, and Time is not always the best measure of significance, Vera interrupted gently. Sometimes a moment contains more meaning than a year, and sometimes a stranger offers what family cannot. Elena took the pendant with trembling hands. The moment it touched her skin, she felt a jolt of recognition, as if the piece of jewelry were returning home rather than being given away. The raven, Vera explained, is a creature that travels between worlds. It can see what others cannot, speak truths that others fear to voice, and find paths that others cannot follow. Wear this, and remember that the journey you are beginning is not just to a place, but to yourself. Elena fastened the pendant around her neck, and immediately felt its weight as both a comfort and responsibility. "Thank you," she whispered. "But I still don't understand why you're helping me." Vera began packing up the remains of their meal. "Understanding will come in time. For now, it's enough that you're to follow your call." She paused and fixed Elena with a penetrating stare. "But I must warn you, the path to the Valley of Echoes is not a pleasant stroll through the countryside. You will face challenges that will test not just your physical endurance, but your faith in yourself and in the journey itself. There will be times when you will want to turn back, when the comfortable life you left behind will seem like paradise compared to the uncertainty ahead." "And if I fail?" Elena asked. "Then you will have learned something valuable about failure," Vera replied. "But if you succeed," she smiled mysteriously, "if you succeed, you will discover treasures that no amount of gold could purchase." Vera climbed back onto her cart and gathered the reins. "The path you seek begins just past Kestrel's Hollow," she said. "Follow the mountain trail until you reach the 3 standing stones. There you must choose between the easy path and the true path. Choose wisely, young cartographer." As Vera's cart rolled away, Elena touched the raven pendant at her throat and felt a surge of determination. Whatever lay ahead, she was no longer facing it alone. She had been given a sign, a blessing, and a warning. Now it was time to prove herself worthy of all 3. The smaller path to Kestrel's Hollow was steeper than Elena had expected, winding through increasingly wild terrain as it climbed into the mountains. The trees grew thicker here, their branches forming a canopy that filtered the sunlight into shifting patterns of gold and green. The air was cooler and carried scents she couldn't identify. Wild herbs, ancient stone, and something else, something that reminded her of the moment just before a thunderstorm. As the afternoon faded toward evening, Elena reached Kestrel's Hollow. The village was indeed abandoned, but not in the way she had imagined. Rather than the crumbling ruins she had expected, she found buildings that seemed to be waiting, doors slightly ajar, windows open to catch the mountain breeze, gardens overgrown, but not dead. It was as if the residents had simply stepped away for a while and might return at any moment. In the center of the village stood an old well, its stones worn smooth by centuries of use. Elena approached it cautiously and looked down into its depths. Instead of seeing her own reflection in the water far below, she saw stars. Countless stars scattered across a dark sky, as if the well were a window to another world. She blinked and looked again. This time she saw only her own face, pale and wide-eyed in the gathering dusk. But the image of the starry sky remained burned in her memory, and she understood that she had just experienced her first glimpse of the mysteries that lay ahead. Following Vera's directions, Elena found the mountain trail that led out of Kestrel's Hollow. By the last light of day, she reached a clearing where 3 massive standing stones rose from the earth like ancient sentinels. Each stone was carved with symbols that seemed familiar, though Elena was sure she had never seen them before. Between the stones, the path divided. To the left, a wide, well-maintained trail led down through gentle slopes toward what Elena's conventional maps indicated was a prosperous valley town. To the right, a narrow track wound up into the mountains, disappearing among shadows and mystery. Elena consulted the mystical map by the light of the moon. There was no question. Her path lay to the right, into the unknown heights. But as she stood there in the silver darkness, surrounded by the ancient stones, she felt the full weight of Vera's warning. The easy path beckoned with promises of warm beds, hot meals, and the company of ordinary people living ordinary lives. The difficult path offered only uncertainty, challenge, and the possibility of failure. For a moment, Elena wavered. She thought of her father, who would by now have found her letter and would be worried sick. She thought of Master Henrik's offer of the comfortable future that still awaited her if she turned back now. She thought of all the reasonable arguments against following a map that might be nothing more than an elaborate fantasy. But then she touched the raven pendant at her throat and remembered Vera's words. "You will discover treasures that no amount of gold could purchase." More importantly, she remembered the feeling that had overwhelmed her when she first saw the map, the sense of recognition. of homecoming, of finally finding the path she had been searching for all her life. Elena took a deep breath, shouldered her pack, and stepped onto the narrow mountain trail. Behind her, the easy path disappeared into shadow. Ahead, the difficult path rose toward the stars. As she climbed, the raven pendant grew warm against her skin, and she heard the distant cry of a night bird that sounded remarkably like encouragement. The Valley of Echoes was still many days away. Still, with each step, Elena felt she was walking deeper into her own story, closer to discovering who she truly was when stripped of all the comfortable roles and expectations that had defined her. The real journey had begun. Chapter 3. The Forest of Whispers 3. Days into the mountain trail, Elena discovered that hunger and exhaustion were minor challenges compared to the voice of doubt that had taken up residence in her mind. As she picked her way along paths that seemed to shift and change when she wasn't looking directly at them, the voice grew stronger. "This is madness," it whispered. "You're following a map that could be a child's fantasy, leaving behind everything real and solid for a dream that doesn't exist." Elena paused at a rocky outcrop to rest and examine her position. According to the mysterious map, she should reach something called the Forest of Whispers by evening. According to her growing fears, she should turn around immediately and return to her father before she became completely lost in the wilderness. The raven pendant at her throat had grown warm whenever she consulted the map, which she chose to interpret as encouragement. But now, in the harsh light of afternoon, even that small comfort seemed questionable. Perhaps the pendant was merely reacting to her body heat. Possibly. Vera had been a harmless eccentric rather than a wise guide. Maybe everything that had seemed meaningful was simply a coincidence, masquerading as destiny. A real cartographer, the doubt voice continued, would have brought proper supplies, conventional maps, and a reasonable plan. A real cartographer wouldn't be stumbling through unknown mountains based on a piece of parchment that a madman might have drawn. Elena forced herself to eat some of the bread and dried fruit from her dwindling supplies. Though her appetite had faded along with her confidence, the trail ahead looked no more promising than the trail behind, rocky, overgrown, and showing no signs of recent travelers. Just as she was seriously considering turning back, Elena heard something that made her freeze. Voices, human voices, speaking in low tones somewhere ahead on the trail. She packed her things quickly and moved forward cautiously. Soon she could make out two figures seated beside the path, an older man and a young boy, both dressed in the simple clothes of mountain folk. They appeared to be sharing a meal and seemed harmless enough, but Elena had read enough stories to be wary of strangers in isolated places. The older man looked up as she approached. "Good afternoon, traveler," he called out. "You look like someone who has been walking for some time. Would you care to join us for bread and wine?" Elena hesitated. Her water was running low, and the prospect of human company was appealing after days of solitude. However, something about the scene felt off, though she couldn't quite identify what it was. "Thank you," she said carefully, "but I should continue on my way. I'm trying to reach the Forest of Whispers before dark." The man and boy exchanged a glance. "The Forest of Whispers?" the man repeated. "That's an unusual destination. Most travelers avoid that place." "Why?" Elena asked, despite herself. The boy spoke for the first time, his voice oddly mature for his apparent age. "They say the forest speaks to those who enter. Some people find that comforting. Others find it disturbing." "What does it say?" Elena found herself asking. "Truth," the man replied simply. "And truth, as you may have discovered, is not always what we want to hear." Elena studied the two figures more carefully. There was something timeless about them, as if they belonged to the landscape itself, rather than merely passing through it. The boy's eyes held wisdom that seemed far older than his years, and the man's face bore the kind of serenity that came from understanding things that couldn't be taught in books. "You're not ordinary travelers, are you?" she asked. The man smiled. "Are you?" Elena laughed despite her wariness. "I suppose not. I'm following a map to a place that might not exist, guided by a pendant given to me by a stranger, seeking something I can't even define." "That," said the boy, "sounds like the most sensible journey anyone could undertake." The man reached into his pack and pulled out a small leather pouch. "Since you're determined to reach the Forest of Whispers, take this." He handed her the pouch. "Herbs for tea, When the voices become too overwhelming, brew a cup and remember that the truth they speak is meant to free you, not destroy you. Elena accepted the pouch gratefully. Thank you. But how do you know about the voices? Everyone who walks the path to self-discovery must pass through the forest of whispers, the man explained. It's where we confront the stories we tell ourselves about who we are and why we can't have what we truly want. And if the stories turn out to be true? Elena asked, If I really am foolish and unprepared and destined to fail? The boy looked at her with those ancient eyes. Then you will discover that failure is not the end of a story, but the beginning of wisdom. As Elena continued up the trail, she found herself thinking about the strange encounter. The man and boy had vanished when she looked back. Not disappeared dramatically, but simply weren't there anymore, as if they had been absorbed back into the landscape that had birthed them. The pouch of herbs in her hand was genuine enough, though, and it carried a scent that reminded her of her grandmother's garden. Lavender, mint, and something else. Something that smelled like comfort and courage combined. The trail began to descend as afternoon faded toward evening. Winding through increasingly dense vegetation, Elena could hear the sound of running water somewhere nearby, and the air was thick with the green scent of growing things. As the sun touched the western peaks, she found herself at the edge of something that took her breath away. The forest of whispers stretched before her like a living cathedral. The trees were ancient beyond imagining, their trunks so massive that Elena could have stood 10 people hand in hand around their circumference. Their branches interwove overhead, creating a canopy so thick that the forest floor was bathed in green-gold twilight, even though sunset was still an hour away. But it was not the visual beauty that made Elena gasp. It was the sound, or rather the sounds. The forest was alive with voices, countless voices speaking in languages she couldn't understand but somehow felt. They murmured and sighed and sang, creating a symphony of communication that seemed to bypass her ears and speak directly to her soul. Elena stood at the forest's edge for a long time, gathering her courage. The voices weren't frightening exactly, but they were overwhelming in their intensity and strangeness. She thought of the man's words about truth being difficult to hear, and wondered what truths the forest might reveal about her own journey. Finally, she stepped onto the path that led between the great trees. Immediately, the voices grew louder and more focused, as if the forest had been waiting for her specifically. At first, she couldn't make out individual words, but as she walked deeper into the green twilight, specific phrases began to emerge from the chorus. "Why are you here?" the voices asked. "What are you really seeking?" Elena tried to answer aloud, but found that the forest absorbed her voice before it could carry far. Instead, she found herself answering in her thoughts, as if the conversation were taking place entirely within her own mind. "I'm seeking the Valley of Echoes," she responded silently. "But why?" the voices persisted. "What do you hope to find there?" Elena realized she didn't have a clear answer. She had been so focused on following the map that she hadn't truly examined her motivations. "I don't know," she admitted. "I only know that I felt called to make this journey." "Ah," the voices murmured with something like satisfaction. "And what are you afraid you might find?" This question struck deeper. Elena continued walking, considering her options, her footsteps silent on the moss-covered path. What was she afraid of finding? Or perhaps more importantly, what was she afraid of not finding? "I'm afraid," she finally admitted, "that I've made a terrible mistake, that I've thrown away a good life for nothing more than a fantasy." "And what would that mean to you?" the voices asked gently. "That I'm a fool, that I'm impractical and irresponsible and unworthy of the love my father gave me." The voices were quiet for a moment, and Elena could hear her own heartbeat in the silence. Then they spoke again, but this time with a different tone, warmer, more compassionate. "And what if you are all of those things? What if you are foolish and impractical and make mistakes? Does that disqualify you from seeking your truth?" Elena stopped walking. The question hung in the air like light through leaves, illuminating corners of her mind she had never examined. I don't know. Consider," the voices suggested, "that perhaps the Valley of Echoes is not a place you find, but a place you become. Consider that maybe the journey itself is changing you into someone capable of discovering what you seek." Elena sat down on a fallen log and tried to make sense of what she was hearing. The voices continued, but now they seemed to be speaking from within her own heart rather than from the trees around her. You were afraid to leave your father's shop because it meant admitting you wanted something more than the life he had planned for you. You were scared to follow the map because it meant admitting you believed in things that couldn't be proven. You are afraid to continue because it means admitting you don't know what you'll find. But consider this. What if the thing you're terrified of is not failure, but success? What if you're afraid that if you find what you're seeking, you'll discover you're capable of more than you ever imagined? Elena felt tears on her cheeks, though she hadn't realized she was crying. The voices had articulated fears she hadn't even known she carried, and in doing so, had somehow lessened their power over her. She reached into her pack and pulled out the pouch of herbs the strange man had given her. Following his instructions, she brewed a cup of tea over a small fire and sipped it as complete darkness settled over the forest. The tea tasted like courage and clarity, and as she drank, the voices of the forest became less overwhelming and more like friendly conversation. You are not the same person who entered this forest, the voices observed as Elena prepared to continue her journey the next morning. Do you feel the difference? Elena considered the question as she packed her things. She did feel different, lighter somehow, as if she had set down a burden she hadn't realized she was carrying. The doubts that had plagued her for days were still present, but they no longer dominated her thoughts. Yes, she answered silently. I feel like I'm becoming more myself rather than less. That, the voices replied with gentle laughter, is the first sign that you are walking in the right direction. As Elena emerged from the forest of whispers into the clear morning light, she looked back once at the ancient trees. The voices had faded to a gentle murmur, but she carried their questions and insights with her like seeds planted in fertile ground. The path ahead led up into higher mountains, toward challenges she couldn't yet imagine. But for the first time since leaving Valdres, Elena felt truly ready to face them. The forest had taught her that self-discovery was not about finding answers, but about learning to ask better questions, and the most important question of all, she was beginning to understand, was not whether she would find the Valley of Echoes, but what kind of person she would become in the search for it. Chapter 4. The Teacher in the Tower. Mountain path beyond the forest of whispers grew increasingly treacherous as Elena climbed higher into terrain that existed on no conventional map. Rocky ledges gave way to narrow passes carved between towering stone walls, and the air grew thin enough that she found herself stopping frequently to catch her breath. According to the mysterious map, she should reach something called the Tower of Winds by midday. As the morning sun climbed toward its zenith, Elena began to see what appeared to be a structure perched impossibly on a needle-thin spire of rock ahead. At first she thought it might be a natural formation that resembled a building, but as she drew closer she could make out windows, a door, and even what looked like a carved garden terrace on the rock face. The path to the tower was a series of switchbacks that tested Elena's courage as much as her endurance. More than once she found herself pressed against the cliff face, trying not to look down at the dizzying drop below. But the raven pendant at her throat remained warm, and she took this as a sign that she was still following the correct route. At the base of the tower's rocky spire, Elena discovered a problem that hadn't been apparent from a distance. There was no visible way to reach the structure. The rock face was smooth and vertical, without handholds or stairs. She walked around the spire's base twice, searching for a hidden entrance or climbing route, but found nothing. Frustrated and tired, Elena sat down on a boulder to rest and think. The tower was clearly inhabited. She could see smoke rising from what appeared to be a chimney, and movement behind the windows suggested someone was home. But how did that person get up and down? As she sat there, Elena heard a voice calling from high above. Looking up, she saw a figure leaning out of one of the tower's windows, an older man with a long white beard and clothes that seemed to be cut from starlight. "Are you planning to sit there all day?" the man called down. "The afternoon lessons begin soon, and I hate to start without all my students present. I can't find a way up." Elena called back, "Have you looked with your eyes or with your understanding?" The man replied. Elena frowned. "I don't understand." "Exactly," the man chirped. "That's why you need to come up for lessons. Look again, but this time look for what is there rather than what you expect to be there." Feeling somewhat foolish, Elena stood and examined the rock face once more. This time, instead of searching for conventional handholds, she tried to see the stone as the map had taught her to see, not just as physical reality, but as possibility. Gradually, she began to notice things she had missed before. What she had taken for natural variations in the rock face were actually carved symbols, similar to those she had seen on the standing stones. And what she had assumed were random shadows were actually carefully planned recesses that formed a spiral pattern around the spire. As Elena traced the spiral with her eyes, she began to grasp the meaning. This wasn't a conventional stairway, but something more like a puzzle that required a different kind of thinking to solve. She approached the first symbol and placed her hand on it. Immediately, the stone shifted slightly, revealing a narrow foothold. When she stepped on it, the next symbol became visible, glowing faintly in the afternoon light. It took Elena nearly an hour to make the spiral climb, stepping from symbol to symbol as each foothold appeared in response to her presence. By the time she reached the tower's entrance, she was exhausted but exhilarated. She had learned to trust something beyond physical evidence, and it had carried her safely upward. The door to the tower opened before she could knock, revealing the older man she had seen from below. Up close, he was even more unusual than he had appeared from a distance. His beard did indeed seem to be woven with starlight, and his eyes held depths that reminded Elena of looking down a well at midnight. "Welcome, Elena," he said, as if he had been expecting her for years. "I am Aurelius, and this is the Tower of Winds. We have much to discuss and little time to do it." Elena stared at him. "How do you know my name?" "How do you know yours?" Aurelius replied with a smile. "Come, we'll have tea and conversation, and perhaps by the end of it you'll have a better answer to both questions." The interior of the tower was impossible. From the outside, the structure had appeared to have perhaps 3 or 4 small rooms. Inside, Elena found herself in a vast library that seemed to stretch upward beyond the reach of sight. Books lined the walls from floor to whatever ceiling might exist in the shadows above, and spiral staircases provided access to reading alcoves carved into the stone at various levels. "Don't try to understand the architecture," Aurelius advised, noticing Elena's bewildered expression. "It's based on principles that your cartography training hasn't yet prepared you for. Sometimes space expands to accommodate what it needs to contain." He led her to a comfortable sitting area where a tea service was already waiting, complete with delicate cups and a plate of pastries that steamed as if they had just come from the oven. "Now then," Aurelius said as he poured the tea, "tell me about your journey so far. What have you learned?" Elena found herself recounting her experiences in detail: the discovery of the map, her meeting with Vera, the encounter with the mysterious man and boy, and her passage through the Forest of Whispers. As she spoke, she realized that what had seemed like a series of random events was actually beginning to form a pattern, as if each experience had been designed to prepare her for the next. "Interesting," Aurelius mused when she finished. "And what do you think all of these experiences have in common?" Elena considered the question. "They all challenged me to think differently, to see beyond what I expected to see." "Good. And what is the most important thing you've learned about yourself?" This question was more complicated. Elena sipped her tea, which tasted like mountain air and midnight breezes, and tried to identify what had changed in her since she had left Valdres. "I think," she said slowly, "I've learned that I'm not who I thought I was. Or maybe I'm learning who I really am underneath who I thought I was supposed to be." Aurelius nodded approvingly. "That is the beginning of all wisdom. Recognizing that our understanding of ourselves is often our greatest limitation." He stood and walked to one of the many bookshelves, returning with a thin volume bound in deep blue leather. "This might help you understand why your journey is necessary." Elena opened the book and found that its pages contained not words, but maps. But these were unlike any maps she had ever seen. Instead of showing geographical features, they depicted what appeared to be internal landscapes, territories of emotion, regions of possibility, mountain ranges of challenge, and valleys of peace. "These are maps of the soul," Aurelius explained. "They show the geography that exists within every human being, the places we must travel to become who we are meant to be." Elena studied the maps with fascination. One showed a desert labeled the Wasteland of Comfortable Habits, crossed by a river called the Flow of New Possibility. Another depicted an ocean called the Sea of Uncertainty, with islands marking moments of clarity and harbors of courage. "But how do you travel to these places?" Elena asked. "The same way you've been traveling to the Valley of Echoes," Aurelius replied. "By accepting calls that make no logical sense following maps that can't be verified, and trusting that the journey itself will transform you into someone capable of reaching the destination. He walked to a window and gazed out at the surrounding mountain peaks surrounding him. Elena, you think you're seeking a place called the Valley of Echoes, but what you're really seeking is the version of yourself that exists there. The Elena who has learned to trust her own voice, who creates maps of possibility rather than just copying maps of what already exists. But what if I never find it? Elena asked. What if I'm not capable of becoming that person? Aurelius turned back to her with a smile that held infinite kindness. My dear child, you've already begun becoming that person. The woman who climbed my tower is not the same woman who left her father's shop. Every step of your journey has been changing you, preparing you for what comes next. He returned to his chair and fixed Elena with a penetrating stare. But I must warn you, the most difficult part of your journey lies ahead. Tomorrow, you will reach the labyrinth of mirrors, where you will face your greatest fear. What fear? Elena asked, though part of her already knew. The fear that you are not worthy of your own dreams, Aurelius replied gently. The fear that seeking your true purpose is selfish, that following your calling means betraying those who love you. Elena felt her heart sink. This was indeed her deepest fear, that by leaving her father and her comfortable life, she had revealed herself to be selfish and ungrateful. How do I overcome that fear? She asked. By discovering that living authentically is not selfish, but necessary, Aurelius replied. By learning that you cannot give others what you do not possess yourself, and that finding your true purpose enables you to serve the world in ways that conformity never could. As evening approached, Aurelius showed Elena to a small guest room furnished with simple elegance. Rest well, he said. Tomorrow's challenges will require all your strength. However, Elena found it challenging to fall asleep. Through her window she could see stars that seemed closer than they should be, and the wind that gave the tower its name whispered constantly around the stone walls. The whispers seemed to carry fragments of conversation, scraps of music, and echoes of laughter from times and places she couldn't identify. As she lay in the narrow bed, Elena thought about Aurelius's words regarding her greatest fear. Was it true that she feared being unworthy of her dreams? As she examined the feeling, she realized it went deeper than that. She feared that by pursuing her own path, she was somehow diminishing the paths others had chosen. She feared that her father would see her journey as a rejection of his love and guidance. But gradually, as the wind whispers lulled her toward sleep, Elena began to understand something new. Her father had given her the skills to read maps and the courage to venture into unknown territory. Perhaps her journey was not a rejection of his gifts, but the fullest expression of them. The last thing she remembered before sleep claimed her was the warmth of the raven pendant against her skin, and a sense that she was exactly where she needed to be, learning exactly what she needed to know, becoming exactly who she needed to become. Tomorrow would bring the labyrinth of mirrors and the confrontation with her deepest fears. But tonight, surrounded by wind and starlight and ancient wisdom, Elena felt ready to face whatever challenges awaited her. Chapter 5. The Labyrinth of Mirrors. Elena woke before dawn to find Aurelius already gone from the tower, though he had left breakfast and a note on the table where they had shared tea the evening before. Dear Elena, the note read, some journeys must be completed alone, and the next part of your path is one of them. Follow the morning star until you reach the stones that sing, then trust your heart to guide you through what lies beyond. Remember, in the labyrinth what you see is not always what is there, and what is there is not always what you need to see. The truth you seek lies not in avoiding your reflection, but in embracing it completely. May courage be your compass. Elena packed her belongings and made her way down the spiral path around the tower's spire. In the growing light of dawn, the symbols that had appeared for her the previous day were invisible, but her feet seemed to remember the way, carrying her safely to the ground. The morning star, which Elena recognized as Venus, hung bright in the eastern sky, and she followed its guidance along a path that led higher into the mountains than she had yet traveled. The air was thin and cold, and she could see her breath misting in the pre-dawn chill. After several hours of climbing, Elena began to hear something unusual, a low, musical humming that seemed to come from the stones themselves. As she crested a ridge, she saw their source. a circle of standing stones similar to the ones she had encountered earlier, but these were different. They were carved with intricate patterns that seemed to shift and flow as the light changed, and each stone vibrated with its own musical tone, creating a harmony that was both beautiful and somehow unsettling. Elena approached the singing stones cautiously. As she drew nearer, she could see that the patterns carved into their surfaces were actually a form of writing, not words, but symbols that conveyed meaning directly to the mind without the need for translation. The symbols told a story of transformation, of souls who had journeyed far from their origins to discover their true nature. They spoke of mirrors that reflected not physical appearance but spiritual reality, and of labyrinths that led not to places but to understanding. At the center of the stone circle, Elena found what appeared to be an entrance to an underground chamber. Stone steps led down into darkness, and carved above the entrance were symbols that Elena somehow understood to mean, "Here begins the journey inward." She lit a small torch from her pack and began the descent. The steps were worn smooth by countless feet, and the walls on either side were covered with more of the flowing script that spoke directly to consciousness. As she descended, Elena felt the weight of the mountain above her, but also a growing sense of anticipation. The steps ended in a vast underground chamber carved from living rock. Elena's torchlight revealed walls that seemed to stretch away into infinite distance, and she realized with a mixture of awe and apprehension that she had entered the labyrinth of mirrors. But these were not ordinary mirrors. The walls were covered with surfaces that seemed to be made of polished silver, each one reflecting a different version of Elena. Some showed her as she had been, the dutiful daughter working in her father's shop. Others showed her as she might become, versions of herself she had never imagined. In one mirror, she saw herself as a successful cartographer in Master Henrik's employ, surrounded by conventional maps and a comfortable sense of respectability. In another, she appeared as a wild-haired hermit living alone in the mountains, having rejected all human society. Yet another showed her as a teacher, sharing mysterious wisdom with students who looked at her with the same reverence she had felt for Aurelius. Elena began walking deeper into the labyrinth, trying to understand what she was supposed to learn from these visions. The path branched and turned, always lined with mirrors that showed different possibilities, different choices, different versions of who she might be. Gradually, Elena began to notice that the mirrors fell into distinct categories. Some showed her futures where she had prioritized safety and security above all else. Others showed futures where she had chosen adventure and discovery, but at the cost of all human connection. Still others showed her consumed by various forms of selfishness or self-sacrifice. As she walked deeper into the labyrinth, the mirrors began to show her not just different futures, but other interpretations of her past and present. One mirror showed her leaving her father's shop as an act of betrayal and ingratitude. Another showed the same action as an act of courage and self-honesty. A third reflected that it was a necessary step in her evolution which would ultimately enable her to serve her father and others more fully. Elena realized that she was not just walking through a physical maze, but through the labyrinth of her own thoughts and fears about identity and purpose. Each mirror represented a different story she could tell herself about who she was and why she was making the choices she was making. The deeper she went, the more challenging the reflections became. She saw herself as arrogant for thinking she could find something that didn't exist on conventional maps. She saw herself as cowardly for running away from responsibility. She saw herself as presumptuous for believing she deserved anything more than the good life her father had provided. But she also saw herself as brave for following her calling despite uncertainty. She saw herself as wise for recognizing that accurate service required authentic self-knowledge. She saw herself as loving for trusting that her father would understand her need to discover her own path. The labyrinth seemed to go on forever, and Elena began to feel disoriented and exhausted. Every reflection showed her something different, and she found it increasingly difficult to know which versions of herself were accurate and which were distortions created by fear or wishful thinking. Finally, she came to a chamber where the mirrors formed a complete circle around her. But instead of showing her different versions of herself, these mirrors reflected each other, creating an infinite regression of reflections within reflections. Elena stood in the center, seeing herself multiplied endlessly, each reflection slightly different from the last. In that moment, surrounded by infinite versions of herself, Elena understood what Aurelius had meant when he said the truth lay in embracing her reflection completely. She had been trying to choose which version of herself was correct, which story about her journey was true, but the labyrinth was showing her that she contained multitudes, that she was all of these versions and none of them. That identity was not a fixed thing to be discovered, but a fluid thing to be created moment by moment. The fear that had driven her into the labyrinth, the fear that she was not worthy of her dreams, that she was selfish or foolish or ungrateful, began to dissolve as Elena realized that worthiness was not something to be earned, but something to be claimed. She was worthy of her dreams, not because she was perfect, but because she was human, alive, and capable of growth. Standing in the center of the infinite reflections, Elena spoke aloud for the first time since entering the labyrinth. I am Elena, daughter of Master Corvus, student of Vera and Aurelius, seeker of the Valley of Echoes. I am sometimes afraid and sometimes brave, sometimes wise and sometimes foolish, sometimes selfish and sometimes generous. I contain all possibilities, and I choose to embrace the possibility of becoming who I am meant to be, not because I deserve it, but because the world needs the gifts that only I can give. As she spoke these words, the mirrors around her began to change. Instead of showing different versions of Elena, they began to show the people whose lives had been touched by her journey. She saw her father, not angry or hurt as she had feared, but proud of her courage. She saw Vera, smiling with satisfaction at a task well completed. She saw Aurelius, nodding approval from his impossible tower. But more than that, she saw people she had never met, future students who would learn from her experiences, fellow seekers who her example would inspire, lost souls who would find their way because Elena had first found hers. The mirrors dissolved, leaving Elena standing in a simple chamber with a single doorway leading forward. Above the entrance, carved in stone, were the words, "She who knows herself serves all beings." Elena walked through the doorway and found herself in daylight again, standing on a plateau high in the mountains. The labyrinth was gone, as if it had never existed. But Elena carried its lessons with her as she consulted her map and saw that she was now very close to her destination. The Valley of Echoes lay just beyond the next ridge, according to the mysterious chart. But Elena no longer felt the desperate urgency that had driven her from Valdres. She now understood that she had been arriving at the Valley of Echoes all along. With each step of her journey, each lesson learned, and each fear faced and transformed. As she began the final approach to her destination, Elena felt the raven pendant pulse with warmth against her heart. Soon she would discover what the Valley of Echoes truly was. But more importantly, she had already discovered who Elena truly was. Not a single fixed identity, but an ever-evolving expression of possibility, courage, and love. Chapter 6. The Valley of Echoes. The final approach to the Valley of Echoes led Elena along a narrow ridge that seemed to balance between two worlds. To her left, the mountains fell away in steep cliffs toward the familiar landscapes she had known all her life. To her right, the air itself seemed different, thinner, more luminous, charged with possibility. As Elena crested the last hill, the Valley of Echoes revealed itself below, and she understood immediately why no conventional map had ever captured it. This was not simply a geographical location, but a place where the physical and spiritual worlds intersected, where the possible and the actual danced together in eternal harmony. The valley was circular, surrounded by cliffs that rose like the walls of a natural cathedral. At its center lay a lake so perfectly still that it seemed more like a mirror made of liquid starlight than ordinary water. Around the lake's perimeter, ancient trees grew in patterns that suggested intention rather than random natural growth. Spirals, circles, and flowing lines that reminded Elena of the symbols she had seen throughout her journey. But what made the valley truly extraordinary was the way it seemed to respond to Elena's presence. As she stood on the rim, looking down, she heard her own voice carried back to her on the wind, not an echo in the conventional sense, but the sound of all the words she had never spoken, all the songs she had never sung, all the truths she had never dared to voice. Elena began the descent into the valley, following a path that spiraled down the inner walls of the natural amphitheater. With each step, the echoes grew stronger and more complex. She heard her own laughter from times she couldn't remember, Words of love she had never found the courage to speak, and most surprisingly, the sound of her own voice, teaching, guiding, inspiring others with wisdom she didn't yet know she possessed. By the time she reached the valley floor, Elena was surrounded by a symphony of echoes, not just her own voice, but the voices of everyone who had ever made this journey. She heard Vera's laughter, young and bright as spring water. She heard Aurelius speaking words of encouragement to students across centuries. She heard the voices of the man and boy from the mountain trail, as well as countless others who had walked the path of self-discovery. But underneath all the human voices, Elena heard something else, a deeper sound that seemed to come from the earth itself, from the stones and trees and water, from the very substance of existence. It was a sound without words, but Elena understood its meaning with perfect clarity. Welcome home. As she approached the mirror lake at the valley's center, Elena saw that its surface was covered with floating objects, maps, scrolls, books, instruments, and artifacts left by previous visitors. But these were not discarded items. They were offerings, gifts left by souls who had found what they came seeking and wanted to share their gratitude. Elena knelt beside the lake and pulled out the mysterious map that had started her entire journey. As she held it in her hands, preparing to add it to the collection floating on the water's surface, she noticed that it had changed. The original markings were still there, but new paths had appeared, routes she had traveled, markers for experiences she had undergone, and most remarkably, new destinations marked in her own handwriting. However, she had no memory of adding them. Before placing the map on the lake, Elena read the new destinations: the Library of Lost Dreams, the Harbor of Second Chances, the Mountain of Necessary Sorrows, the Garden of Cultivated Joy. She realized that these were places she would visit in the future. Her journey to the Valley of Echoes was not an ending, but a beginning. As the map joined the other offerings on the lake's surface, Elena heard a new voice among the echoes, her own voice, but speaking with authority and wisdom she had not possessed when she began her journey. The Valley of Echoes, her future voice explained, is the place where every soul discovers that what they sought outside themselves was always within them. It is the place where seekers become finders, where questions become answers, where the echo of who you might become merges with the voice of who you truly are. Elena stood beside the lake and spoke aloud, her words immediately joining the eternal conversation that filled the valley. I came here seeking a destination and found a beginning. I came seeking a place and found a purpose. I came seeking treasure and found myself. As she spoke, Elena felt a profound shift within her consciousness. The young woman who had left her father's cartography shop no longer existed. In her place stood someone who understood that the most essential maps were not drawn on parchment, but lived in the heart, that the most valuable territories were not geographical, but spiritual, and that the most significant discoveries were not of new lands, but of new possibilities within oneself. The raven pendant at her throat grew warm, and Elena understood that it was time to return to the world she had left behind, but she would not return as the same person who had departed. She would return as a cartographer of souls, a mapper of possibilities, a guide for other seekers who heard the call to discover their authentic selves. As Elena began the spiral path back up the valley's walls, she heard her echo voice speaking words she had not yet thought, but somehow knew she would talk to future students. The journey to authenticity is not about rejecting the world you came from, but about discovering how to serve it more fully. It is not about abandoning responsibility, but about accepting the responsibility to become who you are meant to be. The Valley of Echoes exists within everyone who dares to listen for their true voice and the wisdom to follow where it leads. Chapter 7. The Return, the We. Journey back to Valdres took Elena through the same physical terrain she had crossed on her way to the Valley of Echoes, but she experienced it as an entirely different landscape. Where before she had seen challenges and obstacles, she now saw opportunities for growth and understanding. Whereas she had felt fear and uncertainty before, she now felt curiosity and trust in the unfolding process of life. As she passed through the labyrinth of mirrors, Elena found that the mirrors now showed not different possible versions of herself, but reflections of the unified self she had become. Someone who contained all possibilities while being anchored in authentic purpose. The forest of whispers welcomed her like an old friend, its voices now speaking not of doubts and fears, but of encouragement and recognition. "You have found your voice," the trees seemed to murmur. "Now go and help others find theirs." When Elena reached the Tower of Winds, she found Aurelius waiting for her on the garden terrace, as if he had known exactly when she would arrive. "Welcome back, Elena," he said, his smile filled with infinite warmth. "How do you find yourself?" "Different," Elena replied honestly, "and somehow more myself than I've ever been." Aurelius nodded. "That is the paradox of all true spiritual journeys. We must lose ourselves to find ourselves, must leave home to come home truly." They shared tea and conversation as the sun set behind the mountain peaks. Aurelius presented Elena with a gift, a set of cartography tools unlike any she had ever seen. The compass pointed not to magnetic north, but to true purpose. The measuring instruments calculated not distance, but significance. The pens drew not just lines, but possibilities. "These are the tools of a soul cartographer," Aurelius explained. "Use them to help others map their own journeys to authenticity." Elena accepted the tools with gratitude and reverence, understanding that she was being entrusted with a sacred responsibility. When she departed the tower the next morning, Elena carried with her not just new tools, but a new identity. She was no longer Elena, the mapmaker's daughter, but Elena the pathfinder, Elena the guide. Elena who helped lost souls discover their way home to themselves. As she approached Valdris, Elena felt a mixture of excitement and nervousness. How would her father receive her? How would she explain her transformation? How would she integrate her new understanding with her old life? She need not have worried. Master Corvus was waiting for her at the city gates, his face radiant with joy and pride. "My daughter," he said, embracing her tightly, "I see you have found what you were seeking." "How did you know I would return today?" Elena asked. Her father smiled and pulled a familiar piece of parchment from his pocket, her farewell letter. But like the map that had started her journey, it had changed. New words had appeared in her own handwriting. "The journey is complete when the seeker becomes the guide. I will return when I am ready to serve others as I have been served." "I received this addition to your letter 3 days ago," Master Corvus explained. "I have been preparing for your return ever since." Elena looked at her father with new eyes and saw something she had missed before, a deep wisdom, a quiet satisfaction, and a profound love that had been strong enough to let her go so that she could become who she was meant to be. "Father," she said, "I need to tell you about everything that happened, about what I learned, about who I've become, and I will listen to every word," he replied. "But first, come see what I've been working on." Master Corvus led Elena to the cartography shop, which had been transformed in her absence. Alongside the conventional maps and charts were new sections displaying what Elena immediately recognized as maps of inner territories, charts of emotional landscapes, guides to spiritual journeys, and pathways to personal transformation. "I realize now that I had been mapping only half the world," her father explained. "Your journey taught me that there are territories of the heart and soul that need charting just as much as territories of land and sea." Elena felt tears of joy and gratitude running down her cheeks. Her father had not just accepted her transformation, he had been transformed by it himself. Together they began the work that would define the rest of Elena's life. By day they served customers who needed conventional maps for practical journeys. By evening they worked together to create charts for seekers who felt called to inner exploration. Word of their unique services spread quickly, and soon people were traveling from distant cities to consult with Elena about their spiritual journeys. Elena discovered that her experience in the Valley of Echoes had given her an unusual gift, the ability to help others create their own maps to authenticity. She could sense when someone was ready for transformation, could guide them to the experiences they needed for growth, and could help them interpret the signs and challenges they encountered along the way. Years passed, and Elena's reputation as a guide for spiritual seekers continued to grow. She never charged for her services, understanding that the wisdom she had received was meant to be shared freely. Instead, she asked only that those she helped pass on the gift by assisting others when they were ready. Chapter 8. The Circle Completes. On a spring morning, exactly 7 years after her return to Valdris, Elena was working in the shop when a young man entered. He was perhaps 25 years old, with restless eyes and the bearing of someone who felt confined by circumstances. "I'm looking for someone who can help me," he said hesitantly. "I've heard that you create unusual maps." Elena looked up from the chart she was drawing and immediately recognized the expression on the young man's face. It was the same mixture of longing and uncertainty she had felt years ago when she first discovered the mysterious map. "What kind of help are you seeking?" she asked gently. The young man looked around the shop nervously. "This might sound foolish, but I keep having dreams about a place called the Garden of Cultivated Joy. I've asked other cartographers, but no one has ever heard of it." "They think I'm mad." Elena's heart quickened. The Garden of Cultivated Joy had been one of the destinations marked on her transformed map, one of the places she had somehow known she would visit in the future. But she had never made that journey until now, she realized. Now she understood that her role was not to visit these places herself, but to help others find their way to them. "Tell me about these dreams," Elena said, setting aside her work and giving the young man her full attention. As he spoke, Elena began drawing. Her hands moved without conscious guidance, creating a map of a journey the young man needed to take, not to a geographical location, but to a state of being where joy was not a rare accident but a cultivated practice, where happiness was not something that happened to you, but something you created through conscious choice and spiritual discipline. When she finished, Elena handed the map to the young man. His eyes widened as he studied it, and she could see recognition dawning in his face. "This is it," he whispered. "This is exactly what I saw in my dreams. But how did you know?" "Because I once made a similar journey," Elena replied, "and because helping others find their path is how I continue my own." The young man left with his map, his step lighter and his eyes bright with possibility. Elena watched him go, and felt the deep satisfaction that came from serving her true purpose. That evening, as Elena and her father closed the shop, she reflected on the journey that had brought her to this moment. She had left Valdres seeking something outside herself, and had discovered that what she sought was always within her, waiting to be awakened and expressed. The Valley of Echoes had taught her that every soul contained infinite possibility, and that the most excellent service anyone could offer was to help others discover and express their authentic selves. She had learned that maps were not just tools for navigation but instruments of transformation, and that the most critical territories to explore were not geographical, but spiritual. As she looked around the shop filled with conventional charts and mystical maps, Elena understood that she had found her treasure, not gold or precious stones, but the ability to guide others toward their own discoveries, to serve as a bridge between the world of practical necessity and the realm of spiritual possibility. Her father, now in his 70s but still vigorous and engaged, smiled at her with the deep contentment of someone who had lived to see his greatest hopes fulfilled. "You know," he said, "when you first left on your journey, I thought I was losing my daughter, but I realize now that I was gaining a true partner in the most important work anyone can do, helping others find their way home to themselves." Elena embraced her father, grateful beyond words for his wisdom, his love, and his willingness to grow alongside her. Together, they had created something neither could have achieved alone, a place where practical needs and spiritual longings could be served with equal dedication. That night, as Elena prepared for bed, she took out the raven pendant that had been her companion throughout her journey. It no longer pulsed with warmth as it had during her quest, but it carried a different energy now, the steady glow of a purpose fulfilled and a life well lived. As she drifted off to sleep, Elena's dreams carried her back to the Valley of Echoes, where her voice joined the eternal chorus of seekers who had found their way home. But now her voice was not that of a searcher but of a guide, calling out to other lost souls. The path exists. The destination is real. Have courage, trust the journey, and come home to yourself. Chapter 9. The wisdom of return years flowed like water through Elena's life, each one bringing new seekers to her door and new opportunities to serve. The cartography shop had evolved into something unprecedented, a place where practical navigation and spiritual guidance merged into a single practice Elena had established, what she called the Academy of Inner Cartography. Though it had no formal structure or enrollment procedures, Students appeared when they were ready, often carrying dreams, visions, or simply an inexplicable restlessness that conventional life could not satisfy. Some stayed for days, others for months, but all left changed and equipped to continue their own journeys of self-discovery. Master Corvus had become Elena's most devoted collaborator, his practical experience perfectly complementing her intuitive wisdom. Together they had developed a revolutionary approach to cartography that acknowledged both the outer landscape of physical reality and the inner landscape of consciousness. Their methods had attracted attention from scholars, philosophers, and spiritual teachers throughout the known world. But Elena remained grounded in her original purpose, serving individual souls who felt called to discover their authentic selves. On a particularly significant morning, the 10th anniversary of her return from the Valley of Echoes, Elena was working on a complex map for a woman who dreamed of establishing a sanctuary for abandoned children. As she drew the woman's path toward manifesting this vision, Elena felt a familiar presence and looked up to see Vera standing in the shop's doorway. The older woman had not aged a day in the decade since their first meeting. If anything, she seemed more luminous, more present, as if time had refined her essence rather than diminishing it. "Hello, Elena," Vera said with the same warm smile Elena remembered. "I see you have grown into your purpose beautifully." Elena rose from her work table and embraced her old teacher. "Vera, I've thought about you so often, wondered if our meeting was real or if I had imagined it all." "Reality is more flexible than most people believe," Vera replied with gentle humor. "But yes, our meeting was real as anything can be in a world where consciousness creates experience." Master Corvus emerged from the back room, and Elena introduced him to Vera. The two older souls recognized each other immediately as kindred spirits, and Elena watched with delight as they fell into conversation about the intersection of practical wisdom and mystical understanding. "I have come," Vera explained, "because Elena's work has reached a crucial transition point. She has mastered the art of guiding individual seekers, but now she is being called to a larger service." Elena felt a familiar stirring in her heart, the same mixture of excitement and apprehension she had experienced when she first discovered the mysterious map. "What kind of service?" Vera smiled and pulled a familiar object from her bag. Another map. But this one was unlike anything Elena had ever seen. It seemed to be drawn on light itself, its boundaries and pathways shifting and flowing like living water. "This is a map of the great work," Vera explained. "It shows the paths by which humanity as a whole is evolving toward greater consciousness, deeper wisdom, and more authentic expression. Your role in this work is to establish centers of learning throughout the world, places where others can learn to become guides as you have become." Elena studied the luminous map with awe and a growing sense of responsibility. She could see pathways leading to distant continents, to civilizations she had never imagined, to places where her methods could help entire cultures rediscover their connection to authentic purpose. "But I'm just one person," Elena protested. "How can I possibly accomplish something so vast?" "The same way you accomplished your journey to the Valley of Echoes," Vera replied. "One step at a time, one choice at a time, one act of courage at a time, and you will not be alone. The students you train will become teachers themselves, and their students will carry the work forward in turn." Master Corvus placed a gentle hand on Elena's shoulder. "My daughter, I have watched you grow from a restless young woman into a master guide. I have seen the transformation you create in others. If anyone can accomplish this great work, it is you." Elena looked at the luminous map, then at her father's encouraging face, then at Vera's wise and patient expression. She felt the familiar call rising in her heart, not as urgent and desperate as it had been in her youth, but steady and clear as a bell ringing across still water. "How do I begin?" she asked. "The same way you began before," Vera replied, "by taking the first step and trusting that the path will unfold as you walk it." Chapter 10. The Master's Journey, Elena. A's second incredible journey began not with a dramatic departure, but with a gradual expansion of her work. Following Vera's guidance, she began traveling to nearby cities and towns, sharing her methods with other cartographers, teachers, and guides. Wherever she went, she left behind small seeds of transformation, people who had learned to create maps of inner landscapes and to guide others toward authentic self-discovery. The luminous map Vera had given her slowly revealed itself slowly, showing Elena one destination at a time as she became ready for each new stage of her mission. Her first major stop was the great port city of Ravenna, where scholars from around the world gathered to exchange knowledge and ideas. In Ravenna, Elena established her first formal academy of inner cartography. The city's university provided her with a small building and a handful of students who were intrigued by her unconventional approach to mapping consciousness. Within 2 years, the academy had grown to include teachers from multiple disciplines, all united by their commitment to helping others discover their authentic paths. From Ravenna, Elena's work spread to other academic centers, as well as to unexpected places. Fishing villages where her methods helped resolve ancient family conflicts, mining towns where workers discovered purposes beyond mere survival, and trading posts where merchants learned to navigate the complexities of ethical commerce. Elena discovered that her ability to create maps for spiritual journeys had evolved into something even more powerful, the ability to help entire communities discover their collective purpose and authentic culture. She could sense when a group of people was ready for transformation and could design experiences that would catalyze their growth. Her reputation grew not through self-promotion, but through the transformed lives of those she served. People spoke of the mysterious cartographer who could map the geography of the soul, guiding seekers to discoveries they never knew they were seeking. But Elena's most significant achievement during this period was the development of what she called living maps, dynamic charts that changed and evolved as the person using them grew and changed. These maps were created through a process that combined Elena's intuitive gifts with practical exercises designed to awaken the map reader's own inner guidance. Living maps became Elena's signature contribution to the art of spiritual guidance. Unlike static charts that showed fixed destinations, living maps evolved with their users, always pointing toward the next step in their ongoing journey of self-discovery. Chapter 11. The Circle of Masters. After 5 years of establishing academies and training teachers throughout the continental kingdoms, Elena received an invitation that marked another turning point in her mission. A gathering of spiritual teachers from around the world was convening in the ancient city of Lumenis, and Elena had been invited to share her work with this distinguished assembly. The gathering, known as the Circle of Masters, convened only once each generation. Elena arrived in Lumenis to find herself among teachers whose wisdom traditions spanned millennia, philosophers from the Eastern academies, mystics from the northern monasteries, healers from the southern islands, and scholars from civilizations she had never heard of. At first, Elena felt overwhelmed by the depth of knowledge and experience represented in the circle. These were masters who had spent lifetimes developing their understanding of human consciousness and spiritual development. What could she possibly offer to such an assembly? But as the circle's sessions began, Elena discovered that her contribution was precisely what the gathering needed. While the other masters had developed profound insights into the nature of reality and consciousness, Elena had developed practical methods for helping ordinary people apply these insights in their daily lives. Theory without application. Elena addressed the circle during her presentation, is like a beautiful map that no one knows how to read. Practice without understanding is like traveling without a destination. What I offer is a bridge between wisdom and implementation, between knowing and being. Elena's methods fascinated the assembled masters. Her living maps, her academy structure, and her approach to community transformation represented innovations that could revolutionize spiritual education. But more than her methods, it was Elena's embodiment of her teachings that impressed the circle. She had become a living example of the transformation she facilitated in others. The circle's final session was devoted to establishing what they called the Great Network, a system of communication and cooperation between spiritual teachers worldwide. Elena was chosen to coordinate this network, using her academies as nodes of connection between different wisdom traditions. As the Circle of Masters concluded, Elena felt a profound sense of completion. She had traveled from being a student seeking her own path to becoming a teacher capable of coordinating the spiritual education of an entire generation. But she also sensed that an even greater phase of her work was about to begin. Chapter 12. The Return to Source, Elena. His coordination of the great network required her to travel more extensively than ever before, visiting remote monasteries, hidden academies, and secret schools where various aspects of spiritual wisdom were preserved and transmitted. Each place she visited added to her understanding of the vast tapestry of human spiritual development. But it was during a visit to a small mountain monastery in the far eastern reaches that Elena encountered something that changed her perspective once again. The monastery was home to an order of monks who practiced what they called cartography of the eternal, the mapping of consciousness itself across multiple dimensions of existence. The monastery's abbot, an ancient man whose eyes held depths that reminded Elena of the Valley of Echoes, showed her maps unlike anything she had ever imagined. These charts depicted not geographical territories or even spiritual journeys, but the structure of consciousness itself, how individual awareness connected to universal awareness, the patterns by which souls incarnated and evolved across multiple lifetimes. Your work, the abbot told Elena, represents a crucial stage in humanity's spiritual evolution. You have learned to help individuals discover their authentic purpose within a single lifetime. Now you are ready to learn about a purpose that spans multiple lifetimes, a consciousness that transcends individual existence. Elena spent 6 months at the monastery, studying maps that showed the eternal patterns underlying temporary experience. She learned to perceive the connections between souls who work together across multiple incarnations, the great cycles of learning and service that spanned centuries, and the cosmic purpose that individual purpose served. When she finally left the monastery, Elena carried with her maps that would have been incomprehensible to her younger self, charts that showed the eternal journey of consciousness toward ever greater love, wisdom, and service. But more importantly, she carried a new understanding of her own mission. Elena's work was not just about helping individuals find their purpose, nor was it solely about coordinating spiritual education worldwide. She was participating in the evolution of human consciousness itself, helping to prepare humanity for its next stage of development. Chapter 13. The Living Map of Humanity, Elena. His final great work began when she returned to Valdres after her transformative experience at the Eastern Monastery. She found her father, now in his 80s, still working in the cartography shop but increasingly focused on what he called his legacy project, a comprehensive archive of all the conventional maps he had created during his lifetime. "Father," Elena said as she studied his meticulous records, "what if we created a different kind of legacy? What if we made a map that showed humanity's spiritual journey as a whole?" Master Corvus looked up from his cataloging with bright, interested eyes. "Tell me more about this idea." Elena spread out her collection of maps, conventional charts, spiritual journey maps, living maps, and the cosmic consciousness maps from the Eastern Monastery. Each of these shows a different aspect of the human experience. What if we could create a single map that integrated all of these perspectives? A map that showed not just where humanity has been, but where it's going. The project that Elena and her father embarked upon would consume the remaining years of Master Corvus's life and establish Elena's ultimate contribution to the field of consciousness cartography. They called it the Living Map of Humanity, a dynamic, ever-evolving chart that showed the collective spiritual journey of the human species. The map was both practically practical and mystically profound. On one level, it served as a guide for spiritual teachers, showing them how their individual work fit into the larger pattern of human development. On another level, it was a vision of humanity's potential, a reminder that the struggles and challenges of individual growth were part of a magnificent cosmic process. Creating the map required Elena to synthesize everything she had learned during her years of travel and teaching. She had to understand not only individual spiritual development, but also how individual development contributed to collective evolution. She had to perceive not just the patterns of a single lifetime, but the patterns that spanned generations and centuries. Master Corvus brought to the project his lifetime of experience with conventional cartography, ensuring that even this mystical map met the highest standards of accuracy and usefulness. Together, father and daughter created something that transcended both practical navigation and spiritual inspiration, a work of art that also served as a tool for transformation. Chapter 4. the great completion master Corvus, died peacefully on a spring morning, 3 days after he and Elena had completed the final version of the living map of humanity. His last words to Elena were, "Now I understand why you had to leave to find your way home." The journey was never about geography. It was about becoming who you needed to be to serve the work you came here to do. Elena grieved her father's passing, but also celebrated the completion of their shared vision. The living map of humanity was immediately recognized as a masterpiece of both cartography and spiritual wisdom. Copies were made and distributed to academies and spiritual centers throughout the known world. Elena began receiving visitors from civilizations she had never heard of, all drawn by the map's unique synthesis of practical navigation and mystical understanding. But Elena's most excellent satisfaction came not from the recognition her work received, but from the transformation it facilitated in others. The living map helped spiritual teachers understand their role in humanity's evolution, enabled seekers to see their individual journeys as part of a larger purpose, and facilitated entire communities' recognition of their contribution to the collective growth of consciousness. As Elena entered the final phase of her own life, she established the Archives of Inner Cartography, a vast library and research center dedicated to preserving and advancing the science of consciousness mapping. The archives became the headquarters of the Great Network, coordinating spiritual education and consciousness development worldwide. Elena's students, now masters in their own right, carried her work to every continent and culture. The Academy of Inner Cartography had become a movement, a new way of understanding and facilitating human development that honored both practical necessity and spiritual aspiration. Chapter 15. The Echo Eternalon. The 50th anniversary of her first journey to the Valley of Echoes, Elena made a pilgrimage back to the place where her transformation had begun. She was now 73 years old. Her hair was silver, but her eyes were still bright with the fire of purpose fulfilled. The Valley of Echoes had not changed, but Elena's perception of it had deepened immeasurably. What she had once experienced as a personal revelation, she now understood as part of the eternal process by which consciousness discovered and expressed itself through individual beings. As she stood beside the mirror lake where she had first understood her true nature, Elena heard not just her own echo but the voices of all the souls she had guided, all the students she had taught, and all the communities she had helped transform. The Valley of Echoes had become a chorus of awakened consciousness, a symphony of beings who had found their authentic voices and were using them to serve the evolution of all life. Elena added her final offering to the lake, a small, perfect map that showed the journey from seeking to serving, from question to answer, from echo to voice. As the map joined the countless other offerings floating on the sacred water, Elena felt the completion of her life's work. She had begun as a restless young woman seeking something she couldn't name. She had become a master guide who helped others find what they were seeking. She had evolved into a coordinator of humanity's spiritual development. Now, at the end of her active service, she understood herself as simply one voice in the eternal conversation between consciousness and itself. As Elena made her way back to Valdres for the final time, she carried with her the deep satisfaction of a life lived in complete alignment with purpose. She had discovered her authentic voice and had spent her life helping others find theirs. She had created maps not just of territories, but of possibilities, not just of places, but of potential. The cartography shop in Valdres had become a shrine of sorts, visited by seekers from around the world who came to see where the science of inner cartography had been born. Elena spent her final years there, not actively teaching, but simply being present for those who needed her guidance. Her death was as peaceful as her father's had been, and her final words were addressed to a young woman who had come seeking a map to an impossible destination. The place you seek exists, child. Trust the journey, follow your heart, and remember, you are not lost. You are exactly where you need to be to become who you are meant to be. Epilogue: The Endless Journey. Elena's legacy lived on in the countless souls she had touched, the maps she had created, and the methods she had developed. The Academy of Inner Cartography continued to grow and evolve, adapting to new needs while maintaining its core mission of helping people discover their authentic purpose. The Living Map of Humanity became one of history's most influential works, inspiring generations of spiritual teachers, philosophers, and guides. But perhaps more importantly, it helped ordinary people understand that their individual struggles and discoveries were part of something magnificent and meaningful. Vera, who had remained ageless throughout Elena's lifetime, appeared at Elena's memorial service to place a final gift on her tomb, a simple raven pendant, identical to the one she had given Elena decades earlier at the crossroads. "The work continues," Vera said to the assembled mourners. "Each generation produces souls who hear the call to authenticity, who are to follow their inner maps to impossible destinations." Elena showed us that the greatest cartographers are not those who map the known world, but those who chart the territories of possibility that exist within every human heart. The raven pendant was placed in the cartography shop, where it waited for the next seeker who would feel called to an impossible journey. For the truth that Elena had discovered and taught was eternal. There would always be souls who heard the call to authenticity, always be maps appearing for those ready to follow them, always be echoes from the valleys where seekers became finders, and finders became guides. And in the Valley of Echoes itself, where physical and spiritual reality danced together in eternal harmony, Elena's voice joined the infinite chorus of awakened souls, calling out across time and space to every seeker, "The path exists. The destination is real. Have courage, trust the journey, and come home to yourself." The map was always there, waiting to be discovered. The journey was always beginning, ready to transform seekers into servants of the great work of consciousness awakening to itself. And somewhere, in a small cartography shop in an ancient city, a young soul was about to discover a mysterious map that would change everything. The story was N story, but the story was Et story, continuing in every heart that heard the call to become authentically itself, in every voice that joined the echo of truth, in every soul that dared to leave the familiar shores of conformity and sail toward the undiscovered countries of the self. Elena's map had led her home, not to a place, but to a purpose, not to a destination, but to a way of being that served the highest good of all. And now that theme map was available to anyone with eyes to see it, courage to follow it, and faith to trust that the journey itself was the treasure they were seeking. The cartographer's dream was complete, but the dreaming continued, as it always had and always would, in every heart brave enough to ask the eternal question, "Who am I really, and what am I here to serve?" And the answer, echoing from every valley where seekers had found themselves, was always the same. You are a unique expression of infinite possibility, and you are here to discover your authentic voice and use it to serve the awakening of all consciousness. The map existed, the journey beckoned, the echo waited to become a voice. The end.